Once upon a time, there was a computer with the power of both Intel and AMD combined into a compact mini PC. Intel's Hades Canyon, which was part of their gaming-focused enthusiast line of NUCs, or next unit of computing hardware, featured an Intel processor paired with an AMD GPU. Today, mini PCs are all the rage, and the amount of options are endless with all sorts of shapes, sizes, price points, and performance profiles. It just so happens that my last video covered a modern mini PC, but for me, Hades Canyon, despite its age, has always been the holy grail of mini PCs, and so I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore this unique piece of hardware 6 years later and see if this once mighty PC can still rule over its domain. Towards the end of 2017, Intel made an announcement that at the time felt like hell had frozen over. Intel announced that they teamed up with AMD, the most unlikely of all options, for a range of products that would feature Intel Core chips paired with a custom AMD Radeon graphics much like we've seen for home consoles. The goal of this partnership for Intel was to bring top-tier gaming experiences to thin and light laptops. Now, this partnership isn't as crazy as it may seem, as many know today that Intel's own integrated graphics never could really compete with AMD's offerings or Nvidia's offerings in the laptop space. In many ways, Intel's graphic options represented the lowest end, with Nvidia being the highest end. Intel and Nvidia were not friendly in any sense, given that Intel had to pay out well over $1 billion in licensing fees to Nvidia. As PC World best put it, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's how we ended up with this unusual partnership. But for many at the time, the possibilities were very exciting, as Intel's CPU side was very strong, and pairing them with Radeon graphics using Intel's EMIB, or Embedded Multi-Die Interconnect Bridge, which connected multiple chips to work in a high-density, high-bandwidth package for improved cost-effectiveness, efficiency, and impressive space savings, useful for devices such as thin and light laptops. Essentially, Intel was able to move the CPU, GPU, and high bandwidth memory into a space that is half the size of a typical board. Finally, at the beginning of 2018, during the Consumer Electronics Show, Intel unveiled their mini PC NUC, formerly codenamed Hades Canyon. This product was the realization of Intel and AMD's partnership and would ship in two different SKUs, the NUC 8i7HVK and the NUC 8i7HNK. And referred to this system as their VR-capable machine. It's understandable since the Hades Canyon NUC came packed with the 8th Gen Core i7 processors and Radeon RX Vega graphics. The HVK model and the HNK models had some differences in the specs, namely in terms of the top-end performance, with the HNK model topping out at a 65-watt TDP, with the Core i7 8705G and Radeon RX Vega MGL graphics, with the HVK model topping out at a 100-watt TDP, with the Core i7 8809G and the Radeon RX Vega M GH graphics. The HVK model, which was the top-end SKU, could reach 4.2 GHz turbo on the CPU, and the Vega GH graphics could top out at 1190 MHz, and both were unlocked with the ability to overclock. Whereas the HNK model did not offer this, and on the CPU side it topped out at a 4.1 GHz turbo, with the GL graphics reaching 1011 MHz. It was an impressive pairing, even at the time, albeit an expensive one, that started out at $799 for the bare-bones base model on Newegg. Intel sold these directly as well, and the base model with memory and storage included started out at $999. For me, it was always a dream. I actually very much remember when this product finally released sometime in 2018, and it was around the time I had purchased my first home. And so this very interesting mini PC always remained the holy grail for me. I've always had a fondness of small form factor PCs, and my own personal desktop rig uses an ITX board in a fairly compact desktop case. I guess I've always had an appreciation for the kind of power you can get in small packages. Over the years since the release of Hades Canyon, many mini PCs and laptops have come and gone from my own home, and yet Hades Canyon was always on my mind. And can you really blame me? Just one look at its awesome design and it's hard to forget. Hades Canyon managed to pack the power of both Intel and AMD into an 8.5 inch by 5.5 inch by 1.5 inch space. Something that even to this day impresses me. The top plate, which was removable, had a hidden secret waiting for you, and it wasn't until you turned it on for the first time that the ominous skull revealed itself in the Intel and AMD colorways of blue and red. The NUC itself was surrounded by grills and vents all around the sides and on the bottom. It's understandable with a TDP of both 65 and 100 watts respectively, there's quite a bit of power packed into this compact case. However, Intel utilized some new techniques from the usual in the NUC lineup to help keep Hades Canyon cooler than the god of Underworld would probably like. We have vapor chamber cooling, a massive heat plate and heat sinks, and 2 air blowers that can actually move air out at a lower RPM than usual because of its size, which helped with its acoustics, and man, it was pretty quiet, especially coming from the prior generation with Skull Canyon. The design for me was a definite standout, especially when you look at the prior designs for Intel NUCs and just whatever mini PCs were available at the time. Even right now as I produce this video, I keep glancing over at the Hades Canyon, which I actually have standing up vertically thanks to an awesome stand that I was able to 3D print for it. And I personally think it just adds to the awesome aesthetics here. And you might have noticed something else around the sides of Hades Canyon. We've got a serious amount of ports. The Hades Canyon was very well equipped with all sorts of connection options. This was designed with the intention of VR, and so that does make a lot of sense. This NUC has almost as many connections as my main desktop PC. Hades Canyon could support up to 6 external displays, and it's equipped with 2 HDMI out, 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, and 2 mini display ports. We've got 4 USB-A 3.2 Gen 1 ports, a USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port, and a USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 port. And given that Hades Canyon is older nowadays, it only had Wi-Fi 5, 802.11ac, and Bluetooth 4.2. But it also offered 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, as well as a 3.5mm headphone port and mic input and output, as well as a convenient SD card reader slot. And perhaps the craziest thing about all of this is the actual power supply, which is nearly the same size as the NUC itself. It's definitely understandable as both models shipped with this 230 watt power supply. And I guess you could say that maybe Intel cheated a bit by having this massive power supply remain external, but I think I'm okay with that design choice, and plenty of consoles and laptops have done this as well. Okay, so let's go under the hood, and the top lid with the skull is a pretty simple thing to remove with 6 hex bolts holding it in place. Once removed, we have another plate beneath that holds the LED light for the skull. This plate is held into place with just 1 screw, and disconnecting the cable and removing the screw, this metal plate will come off pretty easily to reveal the key serviceable components of the Hades Canyon. On the back side of this metal plate is a huge thermal pad for the SSD drives. Now, of course, my Hades Canyon was purchased secondhand, and so I have a random assortment of drives in here, and it's actually the first time I've taken a peek under the hood. This is a pretty simple process for anyone looking to upgrade or change out the SSD drives, which are PCI Express 3.0 M.2 that support either the 2242 or 2280 sizes. We also have access to the dual 2400 MHz DDR4 SODIMM slots for memory, which supported up to 32 GB. Now, this is always something I look for in any piece of hardware, since serviceability is definitely an important thing. Now, I decided to leave things alone, but I did want to talk about the opposite side of this motherboard, which holds the dual blowers for the Hades Canyon, and combined with the vapor chamber cooling and massive pipes, really does a good job to help keep things nice and cool. In my experience gaming with it under load, Hades Canyon never got excessively hot or loud, and so Intel did a really nice job here with this solution. And speaking of gaming, that's really what this impressive NUC was designed for from the start. Intel knew that pairing with AMD for graphics would result in the most powerful Intel NUC ever created, and at least in terms of graphics performance, it still might be, but we'll have to wait for another video to determine that. For Hades Canyon though, I came away very impressed, since even in 2024, this mini PC still can game, and quite well at that. Look at it this way, if you purchased a Hades Canyon NUC brand new in 2018 and still own it to this day, you could argue that you got an excellent return on your investment since Hades Canyon can play a lot of the newer releases. One thing that surprised me when I got my unit and started to set things up and get things updated, I found out that there was a driver update package as recent as last year, which was interesting to see and even included specific performance updates for newer release titles like Spider-Man Remastered, which we will definitely be checking out in just a little bit. Obviously, lots of things have happened since Hades Canyon released way back in 2018, and instead of focusing on PC games it could play prior to 2018, let's test games released since Hades Canyon and see how we can handle the newer releases. My version of Hades Canyon is the less powerful one with the i7-8705G and RX Vega M GL graphics, and mostly because in my hunt for an affordable unit, I was able to get the HNK model for a very decent price. And what's impressive is that despite having the less powerful model, the results were still really solid. I thought we can warm things up a little bit with a quick Cyberpunk 2077 in-game benchmark, and using a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with AMD FSR 2.1 set to auto and low settings, Hades Canyon was able to achieve a 31.54 average frames per second, which is not bad at all. But since this is Hades Canyon, I naturally had to start out my actual game testing with Supergiant Games' masterpiece, Hades, which has been running in the background. At a resolution of 1920 by 1080, the game ran without any issues, and realistically I expected so. But let's start to get into a bit more demanding games. I thought it would be a great opportunity to check out a few of my personal favorites for PC on here. I decided to load up some Tetris Effect, which is one of my absolute favorite versions of Tetris, and possibly one of my favorite games ever, which comes to us from the folks responsible for other great games like Lumines and Rez. The game, despite it being Tetris, is a great way to push Hades Canyon and flex some of its muscle, as it is a quite demanding game with all the visual effects. For this one, I am set to use a 1920 by 1080 resolution with medium settings, a 100% rendering scale, and a target of 60 frames per second, and Hades Canyon is doing an excellent job handling this game with those settings. And of course I had to answer the eternal question of whether or not it can run Ori. And Ori and the Will of the Wisps is the sequel to The Blind Forest, which came out after Hades Canyon released back in 2021, and so the sequel is the perfect game to test here with Hades Canyon. For Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I have the game set to use a 1920 by 1080 resolution with high settings, and in this footage we are not using any type of dynamic resolution scaling, and it's doing quite well here, but with a dynamic resolution target of 60 frames per second, and this will run even better, and it's just as visually gorgeous as ever on here. Now, one big thing that has happened since the release of Hades Canyon was the start of PlayStation PC ports beginning in 2020 with titles like Horizon Zero Dawn. So obviously we're going to check out a few of them that have made their way over to PC. So let's start out with God of War, which was very different from prior entries in the series and marked a reboot for the series. God of War is a fantastic game with lots of options to adjust on PC. You can probably see that performance is quite good with God of War, and the footage here is set to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with AMD FSR 2.1 set to quality using original settings and at 30 frames per second, and gameplay is super smooth. Honestly, I'm pretty impressed. Continuing on with more of the great Sony ports, I mentioned that Hades Canyon received some driver updates as recent as last year, and one of the games that were targeted with performance updates was Spider-Man Remastered, which really blew me away at how well it's running here on Hades Canyon. At a resolution of 1920 by 1080 using AMD FSR 2.1, set to use a 30 frames per second scale with medium settings, and the game is running awesome here. Of course, my biggest issue loading up some of these games is just getting hooked by them all over again, and I definitely spent more time in this one than I probably should have. Now, it's been a while since I've featured Ratchet & Clank on the channel, and definitely an iconic franchise for PlayStation. This is the port of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and is a direct sequel to Ratchet & Clank Nexus, with it being the 9th entry in the mainline games. Ratchet & Clank is another Sony port that is doing surprisingly well here, but interestingly ended up being the most demanding of the Sony ports. Here I have Ratchet & Clank set to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080, with AMD FSR 2.2 set to a dynamic resolution scaling of 30 frames per second using very low settings, and Hades Canyon is managing to keep up with these settings. Finally, for one last Sony PC port, let's check out the Uncharted Legacy of Thieves collection, and specifically Uncharted 4 for this video. It's awesome seeing the Uncharted franchise make its way to PC, and like many of the other Sony PC ports, we do have a lot of options here to scale as needed. For Uncharted 4, I am set to use yet again that resolution of 1920 by 1080 with AMD's FSR 2.1 set to quality, using medium settings and a 30 frames per second target, and we are getting pretty awesome performance here. with obviously a lot of headroom to tweak graphics as needed for better performance. So let's continue on with this PC showcase and check out some gameplay for one of my favorite racing game franchises. Forza Horizon 5 is another game that scales very well, and I'm quite familiar with how this one runs on a lot of different setups. For Forza Horizon 5, I went back and forth on settings, but ultimately landed on using a resolution of 1920 by 1080, but with a 60 frames per second target using low settings, and performance is excellent here. I will say that Hades Canyon was very close to being able to run this fluidly at 60 frames per second using medium settings. Now, a fairly high-profile release since Hades Canyon came out was the newest entry in the Diablo franchise, with Diablo 4 dropping on PC last year. Diablo 4 is another game I'm fairly accustomed to in terms of performance across various setups, and so I had great confidence that it would do very well here with Hades Canyon, just based on all of the exceptional results I've seen. With Diablo 4, I am set to use 1920 by 1080 resolution, with AMD FSR2 set to quality with low settings, and we are able to achieve 60 frames per second, and that's again pretty awesome to see here. Finally, we're going to close out with a pair of Remedy games, with Control up first, and I have to say I fell in love with this game the first time I played it back on release, and it's such a great experience well worth playing through. Control definitely comes highly recommended for me, and in terms of its visuals, it's one that can push a lot of systems. So I will say that I tested Alan Wake 2 first, and I was a bit worried about how Control would fare here, but surprisingly, Hades Canyon is doing really well with Control. I have the game set to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with a 1366 by 768 rendering resolution, a 60 frames per second target using low settings, and performance is definitely very solid. Now keep in mind, I am targeting 60 frames per second here, which means that you can definitely bump up the visuals if targeting just 30 frames. Now, I did mention that I tested Alan Wake 2 first, and unfortunately it was just too much for Hades Canyon. And amazingly, it's the only game that I've personally tested out of a good number of games that just couldn't work on here with Hades Canyon. It's very possible that maybe a driver update could address performance, but obviously with Hades Canyon being long discontinued, and now Asus in charge of the NUC lineup, I'm not holding my breath, and sadly, it may be the start of Hades Canyon's reign coming to an end. Regardless, I think the PC gaming performance that we've seen here for a piece of hardware nearing 6 years old is very impressive. So let's now check out some emulation with Hades Canyon. And it's crazy to imagine that in 2018, when Hades Canyon released, Switch emulation had just gotten started, with Ryujinx officially dropping on PC in February of 2018. Of course, Switch emulation is an area that has come a long way since the release of Hades Canyon, and what probably was barely something that was tested back then is now worth testing because of the massive strides made here. I couldn't help it, and I loaded up the latest version of Ryujinx to test out some of my personal favorites with the Switch. It's almost a must for me nowadays to test one of my favorite racing games, and yes, I can confirm that Cruisin' and Blast is working awesome here with Hades Canyon. But I'll do something weird here and go back one generation to check out Wii U emulation with Cemu, which, like Switch emulation, has come a long way since 2018. It's almost a must that with Cemu on PC, we're gonna have to test out The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I'm happy to report that performance is very good here. Once the usual shader compilation takes place, gameplay remains smooth and it does run very well. Moving along to the Sony side, and of course Hades Canyon was already capable of running PS2 emulation with PCSX2 quite well back in 2018. But PCSX2 is continuously improving, and so I thought a quick check to see where we top out would be worth seeing here. It does seem with PCSX2, Hades Canyon can comfortably handle the 3x native resolution setting, which is the equivalent of 1080p. I loaded up quite a few games, and overall the 3x setting was very solid using the Vulkan backend. My favorite racing game, Burnout Revenge, handled the setting without much issue, and considering how fast and frantic the game can be, it didn't hesitate at all. Now for a more demanding game, and definitely a notoriously difficult one to emulate, Shadow of the Colossus was another one that did quite well with these settings. I am still set to use 3x native resolution here, and Shadow of the Colossus has been very solid and just looks super sharp here with these settings. Finally, with PlayStation 3 emulation using RPCS3, this is an area that has seen tremendous progress since the release of Hades Canyon. Now, some games definitely fare better than others, and unfortunately given the age of the Core i7 in Hades Canyon, we don't have any AVX 512 support, which greatly improves performance for PlayStation 3 emulation. However, back in the day, Intel processors were always very strong for PS3 emulation, and despite the age with the Kaby Lake processor, PS3 emulation is faring a lot better than I expected. We can really see that progress on the development of RPCS3 showing through here, and of course, lighter games like Resogun are having no trouble here. But I was pleased with the performance for some of the more popular and more demanding titles like Skate 3. But maybe for me, the best sign of RPCS3 progress was with God of War 3, which I'm pretty sure in 2018 did not fare as well as it does today on Hades Canyon. As always with God of War 3, I used the game patches to disable a lot of the special effects, as well as limit frame rate to 30, and I'm pretty blown away that God of War is running as well as it is here. It's obviously not perfect, but pretty impressive nonetheless. And let's wrap it all up for emulation with Xbox 360 using the Xenia Canary emulator. For me, it's always an excuse to load up my favorite racing game on the Xbox 360, yes, even beating out Project Gotham Racing. The original Forza Horizon is always a fun showcase for the Xenia Canary emulator, and I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming back in 2018, Forza Horizon was probably not playable like it is today, and Hades Canyon is doing a pretty good job with Forza Horizon. It's not perfect, but I have to say that overall I am pretty impressed, and given the age of Hades Canyon, it's pretty cool to see. It's obvious to see the improvements that we've seen over the years with a lot of these emulators since Hades Canyon released, which only serves to give this mini PC additional longevity and maybe even a few more years of usefulness. Now sadly, all good things come to an end, and despite Hades Canyon's incredible performance, the relationship between Intel and AMD was very short-lived. The dream of Intel and AMD thin and light laptops never actually happened, and the only thing we have to symbolize this unlikely mashup is the glow of the blue and red skull on Hades Canyon, which will forever serve as a reminder of that one time Intel and AMD teamed up like some kind of PC Avengers. For Intel, the NUC line would continue on without AMD, and we would see many new versions of NUCs over the years since Hades Canyon. Sadly today, the Intel NUC line is no more, but it has now been turned over to Asus, who will be continuing the legacy of the Intel NUC PC. And for AMD, well, many on my channel know how things turned out for them. Back in 2018, AMD was quickly turning things around, and today, many AMD chips power fantastic mini PCs, laptops, and handhelds that provide tremendous power at low TDPs with great performance. And of course, the star of the show, Hades Canyon, which was a very expensive proposition back in the day for a slightly younger retro tech dad, but being able to find my way to Hades Canyon even many years later has still proven to provide me with tremendous joy. The best part about all of this is that Hades Canyon is still quite capable for today's needs, and surprisingly quite competitive when compared to some other options. One thing's for sure, if you've owned a Hades Canyon since release, you ended up with a pretty awesome investment over the years, and my only regret was not getting my hands on one sooner. I really hope you enjoyed this look at an unlikely product from two opposing companies, and I know I will be returning in the future with more videos like this, but until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.